You say yes when you mean no. You apologize before the other person has even finished speaking. You scan the room the moment you walk in, reading the mood of every person there, adjusting yourself accordingly. You shrink in the presence of someone who seems upset. You feel physically uncomfortable when there is conflict anywhere near you, even conflict that has nothing to do with you. You monitor the emotional temperature of every relationship you are in constantly, and when something feels off, your immediate instinct is to fix it, smooth it, make it better, even when you're the one who has been wronged. You have spent your entire life being described as kind, easygoing, selfless, accommodating. And somewhere underneath all of that, there is an exhaustion so deep it does not even have a name anymore. Because the kindness is not entirely what it appears to be. And somewhere in the part of you that is honest before you talk yourself out of it, you already know that. What looks like kindness from the outside is often something else from the inside. It is fear wearing the mask of generosity. It is a nervous system that learned a very long time ago that the safest way to survive in the presence of an unpredictable or threatening person was to become exactly what they needed, to make them comfortable, to cause no friction, to disappear any need of your own that might inconvenience them. This is called the Fawn response. And it is a trauma response nobody ever identifies as a trauma response. Because from the outside, it looks like the opposite of damage. It looks like virtue. Most people know about fight and flight. Some know about freeze. Fewer know about fawn. Peter Levine and later Pete Walker, a psychotherapist who wrote extensively about complex trauma, identified fawning as the fourth survival response, where fight responds to danger with aggression, flight responds with escape, and freeze responds with shut down. Fawn responds with appeasement, with becoming whatever the threatening person needs in order to not be a threat anymore. In its original context, fawning is not pathological. It is a remarkably sophisticated social strategy. In the presence of a predator or a dangerous person, signaling submission, becoming agreeable, making yourself non-threatening. This reduces the likelihood of harm. It works. Like all trauma responses, it was not a mistake. It was the most intelligent thing a nervous system could do in the conditions it was living in. The problem, again like all trauma responses, is when the strategy gets generalized. When the nervous system that learned to fawn in the presence of an unpredictable parent begins to fawn in every relationship, with every person, in every context that carries even the faintest trace of conflict or disapproval or potential rejection. When the strategy that was built for survival becomes a default operating mode for all of life. Understanding where fawning comes from requires going back to childhood, because fawning, almost without exception, is learned in a relationship. The child who grows up with a parent who is emotionally volatile, who is warm and loving one hour and frightening or cold the next, learns very quickly that the parent emotional state is the most important variable in the room, more important than the child's own feelings, more important than fairness, more important than reality itself. The child learns to monitor, to read the parent's face, tone, posture for early signals of a shift in mood, to adjust their own behavior preemptively, becoming quieter, more helpful, more agreeable, more whatever is needed. Before the situation escalates, they learn that their own needs, their own opinions, their own discomfort, if expressed at the wrong moment, can destabilize a relationship. And a destabilized relationship for a child is not an inconvenience. It is an existential threat. So the child suppresses. The genuine reaction gets replaced with the useful one. The authentic feeling gets replaced with the performed one. And over time, the suppression becomes so practiced that the child loses access to what they actually feel, want, or need, because the habit of replacing those things with what other people need has been running on autopilot for so long that the original signal is barely audible anymore. This child grows up. The parent is no longer in the room. But the nervous system that was built by that relationship is still running the same program. It is still scanning every interaction for signals of disapproval, still managing every relationship by prioritizing the other person's emotional state over its own, still interpreting conflict as danger and appeasement as safety. The adult version looks like a person who is extremely good at relationships in a specific way. They are attentive, accommodating, never demanding, always aware of what others need. They are often described as the easiest person to be around, the most supportive friend, the most flexible partner. the most agreeable colleague. And they are often profoundly lonely inside those relationships, because the relationship being maintained is not between two people. It is between one person's genuine self and another person's comfort. The fawner is always there, but they are rarely fully present, because being fully present with actual opinions and actual needs and actual boundaries feels like a risk the nervous system cannot afford. There are specific patterns that fawning produces in adult life that are worth naming precisely, because naming them is the first step toward recognizing them as patterns rather than simply as who you are. The first is the inability to tolerate someone else's disappointment. When another person is unhappy with something you have done or said, the discomfort is not just uncomfortable, it is unbearable in a way that feels disproportionate to the situation. It produces a physiological response. The chest tightens, the breath shortens, the mind floods with ways to fix it, to explain, to apologize, to make it right. Not because you have actually done something wrong, but because someone's disapproval activates the same alarm that was installed in childhood, when a parent's displeasure had real consequences. The second pattern is chronic over-apologizing. Apologizing for things that are not your fault. Apologizing for taking up space. Apologizing for having a need. Apologizing as a reflexive social lubricant that precedes almost every interaction. The apology is not really an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It is a preemptive appeasement, a way of saying I am not a threat. I am not demanding anything. I am going to make this easy for you. The third pattern is the disappearing opinion. In conversations where disagreement seems possible, the fawner's genuine view quietly evaporates. It gets replaced with whatever seems most agreeable, or with a carefully managed neutrality that offends no one and commits to nothing. The opinion was there. It was real, but expressing it felt too risky. The fawner often describes this as not having strong opinions, as being easygoing. What it actually is self-erasure practice so consistently that the self becomes genuinely hard to locate. The fourth pattern is resentment that cannot be expressed, because the fawner has been accommodating so consistently, giving so much, suppressing so much of their own needs. Resentment inevitably builds. But expressing resentment requires a confrontation that the nervous system associates with danger. So the resentment has nowhere to go. It accumulates, quietly, underneath the agreeableness, and it often surfaces in indirect ways. Withdrawal, passive distance, the slow erosion of genuine warmth in relationships that have taken too much for too long. There is a particular cruelty in what fawning does to the fawner's sense of identity. Because the fawner has spent so long being whatever other people need them to be, they often have very little sense of who they actually are. What do you enjoy when no one else's preferences are involved? What do you actually think about something when you are not managing how your opinion will land? What do you need in a relationship for yourself, not in service of keeping the other person happy, but genuinely for your own experience of the relationship? These questions can feel almost impossible to answer, not because the answers do not exist, but because years of automatic self-suppression have buried them under layers of other people's preferences, absorbed so completely that they have started to feel like your own. This is sometimes called enmeshment at the level of identity. The self has become so blended with the task of managing others that it is genuinely difficult to find where their needs end and yours begin. Some fawners describe it as feeling like a reflection rather than a person, shaped entirely by whoever is in front of them, clear when they are alone, but somehow indistinct, even invisible to themselves, in the presence of others. The relationship between fawning and boundary setting deserves specific attention, because it is where the pattern causes the most practical damage. Boundaries are impossible to maintain when the nervous system experiences other people's discomfort as an emergency. And that is precisely what fawning produces. A nervous system that is attuned to read any sign of unhappiness in others as a signal requiring immediate action, which means that when a boundary is set and the other person responds with disappointment, frustration, or pushback, the very response that would cause a person with a regulated nervous system to hold a boundary more firmly, the fawner experiences it as a crisis, as confirmation that the boundary was wrong, was too much, was selfish, was causing harm, and so the boundary dissolves. Not because it was not valid, because the nervous system could not tolerate what holding it felt like. This is why advice like just set a limit or simply say no while technically accurate, is not actually helpful for someone operating from the fawn response. The problem is not a lack of information about what limits are. The problem is that the nervous system treats the enforcement of a limit as more dangerous than the violation of it. You cannot think your way out of that. It requires something deeper than information. What actually begins to change the fawn pattern is the same thing that changes all deeply embedded trauma responses. Not insight alone, experience. Specifically, the experience of being yourself, with genuine opinions and genuine needs and genuine limits, in a relationship where the other person does not leave, does not punish, does not confirm that being real was too much. This sounds simple. It is not, because the fauna has often organized their entire social world around people for whom their compliance was convenient, and where genuine selfhood is, in fact, unwelcome. Changing the pattern requires noticing this, slowly, carefully, with enormous self-compassion, beginning to distinguish between the relationships that have room for a real person and the ones that were only ever interested in an accommodating one. It also requires developing a relationship with your own discomfort, because fawning is at its root an intolerance for a specific kind of discomfort, the discomfort of someone else's disapproval. And recovery from fawning means building the capacity to feel that discomfort without immediately acting to eliminate it, to sit with someone being unhappy with you and not dissolve, to say what you actually think and tolerate the silence that follows before you know how it landed. This capacity does not build quickly. It builds in small moments of choosing yourself, tolerating the discomfort that follows, and discovering that the worst thing that was anticipated did not happen, that the relationship survived, that you survived, that being real did not cost what you spent your entire childhood being taught it would cost. The fawn response built itself to keep you safe. In the environment where it was built, it did exactly that, but you are not in that environment anymore. The person whose mood you learned to manage so carefully is no longer the one determining whether you are safe. Other people's disappointment is not a verdict on your worth. Other people's discomfort is not automatically your responsibility to fix. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to have opinions that make people uncomfortable. You are allowed to need things, to say so, and to wait while the person you said it to decides what to do with that information. The kindness that comes from genuine care is sustainable. The kindness that comes from fear is not. And somewhere underneath the accommodating, the apologizing, the endless reading of other people's emotional states, there's a person who has actual preferences and actual feelings and an actual experience of what it is like to be alive. That person has been waiting a very long time to be allowed to exist.